also add discipline and consistency. During the earlier session, a number of issues were raised on domestic resource mobilization, on illicit financial flows, investing in human capital, and so forth. The key issue is that we need really to be disciplined in mobilizing resources to ensure that we remain on track, on the chosen path of having or positioning Africa to grow at rates of 7 to 10% between now and 2063, in spite of the economic challenges that are emerging as a result of the two recent disruptions. We need consistency so that we are always strategically focused on the work to be done. Much too often, we formulate documents and they remain on the shelves because we are distracted, because we have lost the energy and we have lost the strategic focus. So the document that we are working on, when it's adopted by the heads of state and government, and hence the presence of the president of Zambia, the key action will be implementation, implementation, implementation. And as we go through that process of implementation, there are a number of key measures that we should always have a keen eye on. And this is the growth in the rate of investment. When we had the meeting last time of the technical working group, Professor Jeffrey Sachs told us that it's possible to position Africa grow at rates of 7 to 10% by mobilizing investment resources to grow from the current level of 20% of Africa's GDP to 40% of Africa's GDP. So that is one of the key measures to say, how are we doing? Is the rest of investment going up or going down in real terms? And we also needed to keep an eye on the share of domestic resources in our investment. This is because there was a message that we should reduce illicit financial flows and we should strengthen our domestic resource mobilization agencies. How are we doing in this direction? These are some of the issues that we need to be looking at. In addition to that, there is always talk that Africa is a young continent with a median age of 19 years, and it has a growing population. Behind that is the dependence ratio. It's quite high. There's always a joke about the African tax or the black tax. And this indicates to the high rate of dependence in our African households. But no serious effort has been made to measure that dependence ratio. Another key metric that we often overlook is the rate of the growth of per capita income across Africa, not just sub-Saharan Africa, the whole of Africa. So each year, and this is actually where we can be helped by the study which we just presented not too long ago on Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook. How are we doing in the growth of Africa's GNP per capita? And there's one metric which is always very close to my heart. And this is the aggregate level of Africa's GDP. We get conflicting statistics. Some put it around $2.5 trillion. Others put it at $2.9 trillion. Others put it at $3.4 trillion. So in the study that we are going to outline, I think we should not really overlook that figure, because when I'm talking of inclusive growth, I think the aggregate level of gross domestic product matters quite a lot. So these are the words that I had in my welcoming remarks. And let me underline the fact that Dr. Musa Faki Mohammed is not with us due to other engagements related to the summit. But in spirit, he's very much with us, and he wishes our meeting a great success, just as much I do. So having said that, we go to the next segment, which are the opening remarks. And I'm going to call on the president of the African Development Bank, who does not need an introduction because he was introduced in the previous session. I don't know if you are going to speak. Yeah, Professor Urama is going to speak on his behalf. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Albert Muchanga. And let me observe all protocols. The President of Zambia, represented by the Finance Minister, Jeffrey Sachs, the Minister from Angola, the UNECA, represented by Hanan Mosi, and also Ms. Chido Mpemba of African Union Youth Envoy. All protocols observed. I'd like to, on behalf of the President of the African Development Bank, first apologize for his, express his regrets for not being able to join us. He's actually currently should be airborne, heading here for the summit. So he asked that I communicate his full support to this report, this study, which was requested by His Excellency Musa Faki Mohammed, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, and endorsed by our president, President Akinwumi Adesina. The reason for this report are obvious. Already in the presentation we had in the first session on the Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook, we have underscored the fact that Africa is growing on a positive trajectory of 3.8% and around 4% for the next 2-3 years in the medium term. But as already stressed by Professor Jeffrey Sachs and President Adesina in their remarks, to be able to pull people out of poverty in Africa, that growth rate is not good enough. As the Minister of Finance from Nigeria underscored, even though Nigeria is growing at a positive growth rate, that growth rate in GDP is similar to the growth rate in population growth rate. And until our countries grow at far higher growth rates in GDP than the growth rates in population, per capita income is not going to improve. And you are going to see poverty still deepening. And people often ask me, what does GDP actually mean when we are having positive reports on GDP, but in the same report, we are reporting that 15 million people were pulled into extreme poverty. In the same year, we're saying that the GDP growth rate is positive. So this is the reason why we are focused now on addressing one of the key recommendations of the macroeconomic performance and outlook report, to work with global stakeholders, experts, our finance ministers and leaders, former and current, youths and women of Africa, captains of the private sector and development partners, to identify those key actions that it will take for Africa to grow at double the growth rates we have now, which is from 7 to 10% growth rate for the next 40 years, coincidentally matching the Agenda 2063. Reason is because we've looked around the world, we studied the literature, and economic development literature does show us that unless countries grow at that 7 to 10% growth rate annually and consistent over 4 to 5 decades, it's difficult to get out of poverty and achieve other sustainable development goals. So this, since this is just speaking on behalf of the president, not going into the main presentation, I would end here by just underscoring that this study is crucial and is a critical part of implementing the recommendations that we see from studies everywhere. We have seen countries that have achieved this, both in Africa and elsewhere, but sometimes we see that those in Africa grow up 2 decades and we see some failed take-ups. So in the main presentation, I will dwell a little bit more on the rationale for the study. But thank you so much for those joining us online. This study is being done by global experts, a lot of people from the United States, from Africans in the diaspora, the African Development Bank Group, leadership staff from several complexes of the staff, the African Union Commission, AUDA-NEPAD, and as many other people that we are still also going to pull in order to ensure that we have a robust study and we identify actionable, implementable recommendations that will have multiplier effects for addressing that the slowdown in growth that we have been talking about. So with that, I would like to again re-emphasize President Adesina's full support to this study, and thank you all for coming, and hand over the floor to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And without wasting time, I'll now move on to the second presenter of the opening statements. And this is the Honorable Dr. Stumbeko Msokotwane, Member of Parliament and Minister of Finance and National Planning of the Republic of Zambia, doing so on behalf of His Excellency the President. You have the floor, Honorable Minister.
Thank you very much. Let me also start with the brief recognitions of the various dignitaries in our midst. You, Mr. Chairman, Ambassador Albert Mchanga, representing Dr. Musa Faki Mohammed, Chairperson of the African Union. I need to start.
Yes, start again.
Oh, I'm told my microphone was not on. So let me start all over. I recognize you, Mr. Albert Mchanga, who is representing Dr. Musa Faki Mohammed, Chairperson of the African Union. And then the gentleman next to you, Professor Urama, Acting Vice President and Chief Economist of the African Development Bank, who is representing the President of the bank, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I have my colleagues, Honorable Ministers of Finance, who are present, ladies and gentlemen. As you heard, I'm making this statement on behalf of the President of Zambia, President Ichilema, and I'm Stumbeko Msokotwane, the Minister of Finance and National Planning. I am delighted to join all of you at this event dedicated to coming up with a program of action on inclusive growth and sustainable development in Zambia. It is imperative that we harness our resources to realize the first aspiration of the African Union Agenda 2063 and attain, and I quote, a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, end of quote. Let me commend Excellencies Dr. Musa Faki Mohammed, Chairperson of the AU, Dr. Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, for agreeing to collaborate on this important project. I also commend the African Union Commission, the AUDA-NEPAD, as well as the consortium of policy experts, scholars, and researchers for coming up with a framework to undertake this study on the key drivers of inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. What we expect from this study is nothing less than the recommendation fit for purpose in the African context. We're expecting nothing less than delivery of a product that will inform policymakers on the interventions that are needed to further strengthening or restructuring to advance inclusive growth in Africa. We welcome the roadmap to have the study completed by December this year and presented for consideration and adoption at the February 2024 Assembly of the African Union Heads of State and Government. This is because Africa is in a hurry to grow and to develop. In July last year, after the mid-year coordination meeting in Lusaka, I was approached with a request to consider assuming the role of champion on inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. Given my strong passion to see Africa prosper, I did not hesitate in accepting the offer. The role of champion gives Zambia the opportunity to contribute in promoting Africa's accelerated growth and sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, we expect this study to address, among others, pertinent issues such as how to leverage Africa's demographic dividends to raise employment and produce more, and how to make Africa to progress along from extraction to value addition. Africa's people, particularly its youth, are our greatest asset. Equally, our natural resources, notably our critical raw materials, give us the opportunity to promote green industrialization anchored on strong regional and continental value chains. Our neighbors to the north, Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, have taken a bold step in this direction by coming up with a joint project on the manufacture of batteries for electrical vehicles. We are on track, and the government of the two countries will soon announce the next steps in the implementation of the MOU that we have signed. Just one example of what we can do collectively to improve our economies. As I conclude, I wish to say what others have already said, which is that getting the African economy to grow can no longer be seen as a pipe dream, especially 50, 60 years after independence. In the 1960s, early 70s, there was perhaps justification in debating or trying to explore what works and what doesn't work. But in the last, from the 1960s, coming to the 70s and 80s, with the examples that we've seen from Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, basically Southeast Asia, and then coming later on from the 1980s, what we've seen from China. I think the story of what works in terms of getting people out of poverty has been clearly laid out in the examples from these countries. And what needed to be done was not rocket science, okay? It was not rocket science. It's something that any country can achieve, provided the leadership is focused on making sure that investment in natural resources, investments in human resources, creating a friendly economic environment, and also making sure that you are integrated in the economic value chain of the world. Because most of these countries you have seen, it was export-led growth that propelled them out of poverty into what they are today. Africa is coming late on the scene, but learning from the experience of these other countries, what they've done, we have no doubt in our mind as Zambians that poverty in Africa can be overcome in the next 40 years. So we look forward to hearing the next steps that are being conducted, and indeed from then to the implementation. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for that statement, very insightful, a contribution to the opening segment of our work. And I would like not to waste time, so I'll quickly invite Professor Orama to make a presentation on the rationale for the study and the progress that has been attained so far. Professor, proceed.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Wichanga. Thank you, Minister, representing the President of Zambia, and all the panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of a number of the study consortium members that are connected online. You are all welcome to this conversation. So today, I'm going to speak on the key actions to drive inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. Before I start, I saw some comments from those online that are not hearing very well. So please do let us know if you are not hearing the session so that we can address that. So the presentation outline will be as follows. We will look at the introduction and Africa's commitment to inclusive growth and sustainable development. Then look at the growth performance of African economies since independence and earlier. Then identify the challenges and opportunities to driving this inclusive growth and sustainable development we've been talking about. And then also propose the actions that we're expecting to take within the study to be able to come up with the recommendations and draw some conclusions and identify a way forward. On this slide, you can see, as already highlighted by the Minister from Zambia, Agenda 2063 of the African Union envisions a prosperous Africa built on the premise of inclusivity and sustainable development. And also, when you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, it also calls for the same thing, sustained inclusive growth. And the African Development Bank Group's High Fives agenda that was introduced by the President Akinwumi Adesina also provides a framework for laser focus on infrastructure investments to drive that inclusivity and sustainability of growth on the continent. And we have seen from the literature, as I already mentioned, that a minimum economic growth rate of 7% is required for countries to be able to facilitate transition from low-income countries to medium or high-income countries. So we should consider growth not only in the numbers, like the GDP growth, but also the inclusivity of growth in terms of addressing inequality, poverty, structural transformation, and other key characteristics required to be able to grow economies in a sustainable way. If we look at Africa, already from the macroeconomic outlook report, if you take a short term between 2019 and 2022, you will, and project to 2024, as we've done in that macroeconomic outlook report, you will have that positive story we told in the earlier session. Africa is resilient, Africa is growing at a positive rate, and the outlook is positive. The red line here on that graph shows the continent. So compared to the other regions, you find that Africa is actually doing well, at par with Asia, almost. But if you look at the right side of this graph, you will see the growth rates of Africa, the annual average growth rate for Africa mapped since 1971. We actually went back to the 1950s and the trends were the same. So what you see here is like a spaghetti, an up and down story where Africa is rising and falling, depending on the exigencies of the shocks that we see in the global financial market, in the global markets. So we find that a lot of what the minister already raised is at the roots of this, because you map Africa's GDP growth, you find that it is trending the trends in the global commodity markets, the prices of global commodity markets. So we need to actually see how we are going to decouple Africa from that dependence on commodities. If you look at the macroeconomic performance of Africa on a longer term, not just the short term, short and medium term that we looked at in the AEO, you find that Africa has been doing well relative to other regions, growing at 4.6% between up to, for the past 2 decades, up to 2019, prior to 2019. But we saw the shock in COVID, but the rebound that we have seen because of the resilience of the continent as well. And we're seeing that Africa in 2021 grew by 4.8%, and this year 3.8%, next year going back to 4%, and so on. So you see that still upward and downward trajectories. And the point we need to take home from this slide is that 4.8% is not good enough to be able to pull people out of poverty, especially in a continent where the growth rate in population is also equally very high. So when you look at Africa and the historic performance of economies as a share of the global economy, then we start seeing a more depressing story than what we had in the macroeconomic outlook report. Here we see from 1995 to 2018, and that arrow is showing Africa almost on the x-axis of this graph. So compared to other regions, you see the regions that are doing well on top, East Asia and the Pacific, European Union, North America, and so on, you are seeing an upward growth trajectory. But if you look at Africa, it's a flat line, because that up and down, when you average it, you are actually not growing that much. Why is this happening? Intra-regional trade in Africa has been low compared to all the other regions. 47% in America, 67% in Europe, 61% in Asia, about 15% in Africa. So that's already one key area that our leaders have already identified, and that's why the ACFTA has been enacted. And we see that the share of Africa's growth of global trade has actually been going down. So we were doing better at independence than we are doing now. If you look at that figure, you can see the black lines on the x-axis. You find that it is declining. So that's worrying. If you look at the historic performance in terms of average growth rates by decades, basically trying to look at growth on chunks of decades, each decade, to see whether any African country has been able to grow for 7 to 10% consistently over that 4 decades we have been talking about. And then you'll find that that's not the case. Between 1970 to 79 up to 2020 to and 2010 to 2021, you see that flat line that's actually trending the average growth rate by decades on the continent. So we need to do more in order to be able to move forward. But if you look at country by country, some countries have been able to do that, growing at above 7% for maybe 1 decade, 2 decades, but then we see a crash. what I call failed takeoffs. So another key thing we want to look at in this study is, why do we have those experience of spikes and falls? Why the failed takeoffs in Africa? And you see countries like Equatorial Guinea and others that have done well for some decades, and then you have a crash. What happened? And how can we identify, place a handle on what are the drivers of the rise or fall in countries? And then we look at China. And as Professor Jeffrey Sachs has already told us, you see that China has over several decades grown above 7%. So it's possible. You look at other countries as well, South Korea, Singapore, and others. Vietnam is beginning to see that. We're seeing trajectories in India and so on. So it is possible to do this. So why is it that for Africa, we continue to see up and down trajectories? You know, when I read The Economist and they write about Africa rising, I used to think about, why are we rising? It means we fell. Because if you are not on the ground, you don't need to rise. I want to see Africa cruising, not rising. Stay on top and continue to move. And that is what we want to address going forward. Now, you look at human capital development. Jeffrey Sachs has already mentioned that. Again, compared to other regions, our investments in human capital development and the index of human capital development in Africa is not a good story. So we need to implement such policies like Jeff was proposing in the morning to try and drive that going forward. And then if you look at each African country to create baselines of where countries have been, you also see some countries are going up gradually, some are going up and coming down. And when you read the concept note that we have shared with you, you'll find some of the countries we are seeing as some good cases where we're seeing an upward trajectory, even if it's not up to that 7% that we're still talking about, but are going up consistently over some decades. Can we identify what they are doing and try to maintain that? That sets the context of why this study. But there are challenges to these opportunities we talk about. We did this concept note when COVID-19 was almost at the peak, and I heard in almost all conferences, people trying to blame COVID for Africa's debt challenge, for Africa's, all the issues there, because that was a moment what we're talking about. But if you looked actually at a longer term, COVID is not the major driver of Africa's structural challenges that we have on the continent. There are things we need to do so that we're able to become more resilient and build on the resilience that we have. One is what I call the commodities conundrum. We don't have to talk about it so much again. Banjo Yeyinka stressed on it in the morning. Africa holds 30% of the world's mineral reserves. 80% of platinum, 77% of cobalt, 51% of manganese, 46% of diamonds, 22% of gold, 60% of world, or to 65% of world's arable land. Just name it. Almost everything you talk about, Africa is very rich. But Africa is still among the poorest compared to other regions. So what's going on, and how do we translate these potentials we have in the natural resources sector to actually wealth creation? These are things we need to think about. When you look at the prices of the impact of this reliance on commodities on Africa's revenues, it's actually very telling. Besides diamond and gold, all other Africa's commodities traded in the global markets, its real prices have been going down since the 1960s, just deflated by inflation. And then you see that you're actually losing more by trading more on commodities. Why? The revenues and the benefits of trade always go to technology owners because they produce. Consumers don't define profit. If you look at cocoa, for example, Africa owning about 70% of it, but only 3 to 6% of chocolate retail market. So the trillions of dollars in the chocolate market we are not accessing. So just add value to cocoa, and you'll find Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana will become really very wealthy. Crude oil prices also remains in that volatile rates. And as I mentioned in the morning, structural problems in the country means that we don't even take advantage of price increases when there are price hikes in the crude oil market, like we have seen in the last 2 years, and still the oil exporting countries are not doing very well because of the challenges we discussed in the macroeconomic outlook. Zooming in on Zambia and other countries and South Africa that has a lot of copper that will drive the electrical vehicles and the new industrial revolution, something was striking for me, because you find that when we did this analysis, 43.7% and 12% of global exports in 2018 was from Zambia and South Africa. This is crude copper. But if you looked at the market, the total market value was far less than the market value of copper concentrates by a quantum of like a factor of 10. So by trading copper and not copper concentrates, you are losing money. And you are also exporting labor. You are exporting employment. You are exporting several things. So this underscores the need for value addition in our natural resources sector. Factor productivity in Africa is also very low in all sectors. And here we use agriculture, crop yield. You find the red line on the x-axis. That's where Africa sits. We need to change it so that we're actually going up like the others, like we see in East Asia and the Pacific and Europe. Again, the point that the president raised in the morning, institutional capacity and government effectiveness, major challenge. When you look at Singapore, they talk about 3 things that made them be able to grow. And Commissioner Muchanga mentioned it: meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. So we need actually to improve on our public administration. We need to improve on our budget and public financial management, economic management, and also revenue mobilization. And this is why the African Development Bank and the World Bank and IMF are collaborating with many institutions in Africa to and have launched the Public Financial Management Academy to address that. Why focus on institutions? Institutions drives transaction costs, the creation of markets, specialization and division of labor, productivity that was called for in the morning, and also economic performance. But it also drives how people behave, the behavior of organizations, the process of creative destruction, and technological progress and wealth creation. So we need to really focus on building institutions in order to move this forward. How is Africa performing? You see here again on very close to the x-axis, 0.4% investment in R&D compared to other countries where it's 3 to 4% that they are investing in R&D in order to be able to grow forward. And again, for this reason, the African Development Bank is working with partners to develop what we call a knowledge and capacity development fund for Africa to be able to mobilize resources for soft infrastructure as we are doing for hard infrastructure on this continent. Patent applications in Africa remains very low. I don't need to over stress that. You look at the picture there, you can see that we are really very far. Trade and regional integration, we need to do more. And this area I won't stress a lot because our leaders themselves have identified it by enacting the ACFTA. But how we implement that ACFTA, as we heard from Banjo Yinka this morning, is crucial so that we're not trading in those raw materials again, but actually using it as an engine for boosting productivity and manufacturing and adding technological inputs to our products that we trade so that we can also earn rents from our products. If you look at Africa over the previous several decades again, we see that structural transformation has not been happening at the rate it should. When we decompose this by regions, we'll find that regions like Eastern Africa is a little bit better in terms of seeing the diversification of the economies and the structural transformation there, but it's still not good enough. So we need to keep thinking, how can we actually ensure that our policies drive structural transformation, industrialization, and other things we have been talking about. But Africa is not operating in a vacuum. We also need to think about the external drivers that is limiting growth on the continent. Climate change is a huge one, and I don't need to overemphasize it again. Our AEO 2022 was on this topic. But just bear in mind that building infrastructure that are not climate resilient is actually risky. because one event can wipe it away and you have to rebuild again. Global insecurity and also regional and local insecurity and the types of security issues is eating into the fiscal space of countries and the spillover effects we can see from the Russia-Ukraine war. The geopolitics of development, I won't talk so much about this because we have the expert of that here, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and I'm sure he's going to speak a little bit on how the current global financial architecture actually discredits Africa and creates the conditions for perpetration of poverty on this continent. So what do we need to do in terms of reversing or reviewing how we engage in this global financial architecture so that Africa can actually break the shackles of poverty? And the spillover effects of other global market trends, we have seen a lot of that in the study, in the paper we presented in the morning. The infrastructure gap remains huge, estimated to about 68 to 108 billion US dollars of investments annually. And this is where I'm happy to see Dr. Marilaw Akinolubade, who is responsible for actually making this happen in Africa, and other vice presidents from the bank that has been here. This is a key drag for economic development on the continent because it increases the cost of capital, cost of doing business, and also reduces productivity of labor. So we need to think about what to do with that. But financial flows, another area I'm also sure that, that Jeffrey Sachs will talk about. If you track financial flows on the continent, the promises being made are not always being met. ODA, for example, that was promised to meet 0.7% of GDP, in many countries is nowhere near there. And then they're also being rebranded for other things. As climate change comes, ODA goes to climate change. COVID comes, is COVID. So it's actually not addressing structural policy issues that can help Africa to break out of poverty. So we're doing maybe just emergency response actions and so on. But again, it's also been declining until after COVID when we saw some rebound. And this is just a picture on foreign direct investment that we all try to think about. Compared to other regions, Africa's share of FDI inflows is also very low. So look at that black dots on the x-axis as well. So that needs to increase massively if Africa is going to actually be able to break the vicious cycles of poverty. Debt vulnerabilities and consumer price inflation we've talked about in the morning, so I'm not going to repeat that, but the cost of capital is something that was alluded to in the morning. And here is the data. It actually costs a lot more for Africa to borrow in the same global market than other countries to borrow from the same markets. So again, it's discrediting, disenfranchising Africa in playing in that same market that we are meant to believe it's fair and transparent. So the incidence of poverty remains a major challenge. We have talked about it, over 60 million 2020, 2021, and then over 15 million 2022. That's additional going into extreme poverty. It's not a good story to tell. So because of all these issues, the African Union Commission and the African Development Bank Group has come together to design this study, which we are presenting to you, part of the consultative process of hearing from you what we need to look into as we continue to go to the field for this study to happen, to identify the key actions that we require to do at country level, at the regional level, at the Pan-African level, but also key actions that global development finance institutions need to take into account if they really want Africa to be able to achieve this sustainable development goals, but also what the other global institutions like the UN and co should be doing. So we want to draw from these visions policy actions that are already taken by the African Union, the bank, and African countries. Why have they not worked? And in this case, I will really call on former ministers, former leaders of the bank, of countries, to actually come forward to tell us your experiences. Because sometimes it's not we don't have the good policies. We do have the good policies. We do have the good strategies. We do have good action plans and projects. But some other things make it not really function as it does in other places. We need to understand what those things are. So we want to leverage existing policies, not to duplicate them, but find how to make them implementable as we go forward. So objectives of the study I've already talked about: identify the enablers and barriers to growth, formulate remedies to those enablers, to those barriers, and actions to amplify the enablers, address barriers and amplify the enablers, explore synergies and complementarities between countries, within countries. Where do we have comparative advantages that we can actually trade with each other and be able to move things forward? And then propose key actions to be considered by our leaders as a blueprint, if I dare say, for growing at 7 to 10% for the next 40 years. So key questions we have been asking, I'll leave that on the screen. I'm not going through all of them. If you look at the concept note, you'll find all of them. The questions we're already asking to drive how we do the study. And this slide is also still talking about the questions. What are the emerging things from the studies, the work we have done so far? We need to enhance state capacity. And I'll pause because that's loaded. We need to enhance state capacity on the continent. Macroeconomic stability is key. We need to reduce dependence on natural resources. We have talked about it, but how are we going to do it? That's what this study will come up with as well. Human capital formation is still very relevant in many African countries. Private sector engagement, policies that will leverage private sector engagement is already coming out as key drivers that we need to think about. Regional integration and trade, digitizing economies and improving social inclusion, harnessing the demographic dividend of this continent is also another thing that's already coming up. But we need to strengthen public financial management in terms of revenue mobilization, building and deepening our capital and financial markets, prudential budgeting and public expenditure management, sustainable borrowing, but also transparency in how public resources are being used and curbing illicit financial flows. Like I said in the morning, we lose about 90 billion on illicit financial flows annually. If we only plug that, and that is about 3.7% of Africa's current GDP growth. So if you add 3.7 to 3.8 we have now, we have reached 7% already. But it's not that simplistic. I'm just trying to be kidding about this one. But it's very important that we focus on trying to address that. The challenges we face are already addressed in the morning, so I'm not going to go back to it. So we won't pretend that just by identifying key actions, it happens when it's tap of hand. We need to be able to identify country by country what are the key endogenous and exogenous challenges they face and how do we address them. Broad-based policies required, climate-friendly solutions needed. ACFTA should be operationalized to make Africa a productive zone and manufacturing and industrial area. And then significant scaling of low-cost affordable financing is required. The magnitude of financing required is mind-boggling. So if you think about it, we need innovations, as we also been called for in the beginning. And finally, Africa can achieve that 7 to 15%. And I'm saying 15% because some countries have great potentials to overshoot the 10% that we've been talking about for the next four decades and build that Africa we want. Closing words, huge opportunities, huge challenges, but in the middle of these challenges, Einstein says, lies opportunities for innovation. So we need to think, I would say, without the box. There is no box actually, because we create them in our minds. So let's think innovatively on how to drive this. But we cannot use the old map, the old models of economics, economic development, and so on. Maybe the ones that Jeff taught in his class, which is not being applied by IMF, could help. But we need to think outside the box, really, or without the box, to be able to explore the new world. The challenges we face are new and novel. We need novel approaches to be able to address them. But we need to keep in mind that in doing this, redistribution of resources is inevitable. And I'll pause there because that's where it really hits. Why they told Jeff that the model, the business model doesn't fit is because of redistribution of resources. So we need to face that fact that even within the continent, there will be some kind of redistribution of resources if we are going to be able to achieve this. And this is our new normal, 7 to 10% growth from 2023 to 2063. And we can do it. Let's stand together and make it happen.
Thank you very much, Professor Rama, for that comprehensive elaboration of the study, looking at the background and the key issues to be addressed in the study, among others. And I think they opened up possibilities for panel discussions. And we're going to go to the panelists. And the panelists we have there, Excellency Dr. Vera Davis de Souza, the Minister of Finance of Angola, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Economist and Director, the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University in New York, United States of America, and Dr. Aman Asfu, President of the African Business Council, who is not yet with us. Are you there? Not yet. And also Antonio Pedro, Acting Executive Secretary of UNECA, is not yet here.
Presented by Hanan.
Where's Hanan?
She's there.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you, my good sister. I could not see you. Then the African Youth Envoy, Ms. Chido Bemba. So I'll begin with the Minister of Finance of Angola. They're basically representing all the African countries here. So from a national perspective, and somebody who is charged in ensuring that the country moves out of poverty into sustained growth and development. In your view, how can you leverage the study to ensure that Angola takes off into sustained growth and development? You have the floor, Honorable Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Muchanga, dear Minister of Finance from Zambia. Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, let me first thank you for being invited as a panelist. It's a pleasure to be here. And also congratulate the African Union Commission and AFDB for carrying this important study that we believe that will have a double contribution. One is to calibrate our policies, the African country policies, to achieve those purposes of inclusive growth and sustainable development, and at the same time signalize to our multilateral and bilateral partners which avenues we can explore together. Each country has its own strategy, but I think we have common objectives and common fragilities, as the study raised. Angola is working on some of those, especially trying to do their best to improve the private sector participation, to make sure that the private sector is the main driver of the economy. You already know how dependent we are from the oil sector, as we have dependencies from natural resources in other African countries. So considering that that is not a box that we need to get rid of it, we should explore everything else that we have at our disposal to take the advantage from the markets and the potential from the continents, the inter-regional trade, producing or production or providing services, goods and services with more value added to make sure that we can optimize our demographic dividend, exporting those goods and services and creating jobs and transforming lives. So for that to happen, we should be totally committed at removing all the obstacles from the way, and we have some of them. I want to stress some of them. First is to improve the business environment. I think we need to look very careful to it. Starting with the political stability, we need to be stable to give confidence to the investors to come and to invest. Even the domestic ones, they want to feel confident about our environment, our political environment. So this is also part of the business environment. To tackle the excessive bureaucracy in some of our services. Professor Kevin Urama, that I want to recognize the comprehensive presentation, appointed the functioning of the public administration. We have margin to progress. The small corruption, this is something that also avoid us to move faster in terms of attracting private investments, internal or external, and a fiscal environment that is business friendly, but at the same time enforcing those fiscal law, because we make an effort to be more modern in our fiscal system in so many fronts, not only the fiscal. Regarding the legal framework, we are doing a lot of progress, but we have some fragilities regarding the enforcement of the law. So it's something that we need also to work on, and to the efficiency of our justice bodies, to make sure that the private sector understands that the justice function, and if something goes wrong, the justice bodies will be there to correct those inefficiencies or bad behavior. Human capital is key. We are preparing our national development plan for 2023-2027, and human capital is the main pillar, capacity building, improving the levels of budget allocation for education, improving vocational and technical skills. It's key to make sure that our population could be part of our growth and development strategy. Regarding infrastructures, I think it's not only a matter of creating new ones, but is also a matter of understanding in which parts of the country, what are the comparative advantage that we have, and put the infrastructures in a way that we can explore those comparative advantage apart from natural resources, apart from primary sectors. For example, we want to put a lot of energy on agri and tourism. So Angola needs to find out where to start, where to put a road, where to start investing on electricity and water, considering those two pillars, agri and tourism. We have a huge country. Our fiscal space do not allow us to do everything at the same time. So we need to have a strategy starting to invest on those parts, on those projects where we can create, we can add value, and with the revenues and the GDP growing coming from that, we'll be able to address other parts of the country and finance other other projects, and also to see how the private sector can move together with us, addressing those needs of infrastructures. For example, via PPPs, and how the multilateral partners could move together with us on this. But another part of the infrastructure side is also the maintenance of those infrastructures, because we cannot, from 5 to 5 years or to 10 to 10 years, do it again. So we need to have a model when we are able to maintain those infrastructures with local capacity and find a way that the infrastructures can pay themselves in terms of maintenance capacity. Financial systems that are resilient, good services, modern products, not discriminating SMEs. That is something that our banks tend to do. They want to work only with the big companies, but we need also to find a way that the SMEs are part of our growth and our strategy on development, to make sure that they can help us to boost the economy and create jobs. And finally, take a long, open, and committed look to inside. To the domestic investors, to the country neighbors, to make sure that we follow the way that sometimes is not the easier way, but for sure is the sustainable one. Do more with our local people, do more within Africa, and take advantage from all the potential that we have. And finally, and for all, transform the word potential in real and practical realization and delivered. So it's something that we need all to be committed with. And after all this, at the end of the day, we will be able to reach the purpose that is common, that is to grow more than our population grow, and to make sure that we are proud of being African, not only because of our potential, but because we are really delivering and happening in terms of growth and inclusive growth, and be proud of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for your very, very useful contribution. And with respect to private sector engagement, all I can say is that right now, upstairs, we have mobilized the African private sector to see how they can contribute into supplying the market of the African continental free trade area. I'll now turn to Professor Jeffrey Sachs. You have highlighted consistently on the need to raise the investments across Africa from 40%, from 20% of GDP to 40% of GDP. I don't know if you can share perspectives with us on what Africa should do to ensure that we really increase that rate of investment. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. I think the goal of this exercise is extremely important, which is a deep quantitative visioning exercise of what Africa can achieve during the coming 40 years. And as I mentioned in the session this morning, I think what Africa can achieve in the coming 40 years is what China achieved between 1980 and 2020. 40 years in which the Chinese economy grew roughly 35 times and went from poverty to a very strong economy, indeed by some measures the largest economy in the world. Africa has the same population as China, and it has the same potential as China, but it requires obviously a deep strategy. to achieve this kind of result, because what China achieved resulted from a deep strategy. It was not something that just happened. It was something that was promoted by Chinese leadership, by the National Development and Reform Commission, by strategists over the course of 40 years. And this, I think, is Africa's challenge. I don't believe this can be viewed as one country at a time, even though each country has a very important role to play, because it will be the cumulative Africa-wide process that will carry each of the countries forward, help set improved policies, make financing available, and solve infrastructure problems. Africa needs an Africa-wide power pool. Africa needs an Africa-wide fiber network. Africa needs an Africa-wide transportation network, both highways and, I would say, especially fast rail. And that means that no country on its own can accomplish this. These are big projects. They require a lot of financing. They require a lot of cooperation in the countries. I think the progress that the African Union has made in the last 10 years is extremely important, because it is only in the last 10 years that the real idea of a single market and an integrated prioritization of Africa-wide infrastructure has come to the fore. So I think that the base for this kind of development really wasn't there 20 years ago. Individual countries could do their best, often surrounded by a lot of chaos in their neighborhood, but it was very hard to get this kind of long-term, rapid development. Now, I think what's crucial is that at the base, long-term rapid development comes from investments. And rapid growth comes from high levels of investment relative to the size of the existing economy. So to grow faster means to invest a higher proportion of GDP. What is crucial, though, to understand is that these investments are both public and private. So there's no possibility to say we're going to have private sector-led growth. That's not possible. Of course, private sector is crucial, but without the public sector, there's no private sector-led growth. And the reason is that there are really at the core 4 kinds of investments that need to be made. The first is physical infrastructure, power, fiber, roads, transport, water and sanitation, urban infrastructure. And these are by and large public sector investments. Of course, the private sector can contribute, but I don't know of a single country where the private sector does this on its own, because these are monopoly sectors. So if you hear about the privatization of the utility sector, don't believe it. Nobody has a private utility sector. They may have private utilities that are publicly regulated, but this is a public investment, and that's crucial. The second investment is, and the most important fundamentally, is in human capital. First, basic healthcare, nutrition, healthy brain development, healthy child development. It's fundamental, obviously. And then children in school learning. Africa needs all of its school-age children in school, all of them. This is not so hard to accomplish, but I'll come back to it in a moment. But that is a public effort. No private sector is going to solve that problem. What the private sector does with health and education is cater to the top 1% or the top 5% or the top 10% of the population. But that's not economic development. Economic development is ensuring that all children have at least an upper secondary completion. But I would aim, and I think this study should aim, that 30% or more of African young people have a university degree by 2040 or so. Absolutely achievable, even faster, especially with online education. So this is the second area of investment. It's public. No business is going to come other than to take oil and gas or cobalt unless there are skilled people in the workforce. What a business wants is, are there managers locally? Are there engineers locally who can manage the technologies? Are there people who can be a good interface with the international community? That's all education. And so this education as the second fundamental part or human capital is critical. The third is business development. And of course, that's overwhelmingly private sector. And it's both domestic businesses and international businesses. But I tell you, if there's no electricity, they're not coming. If they have to depend on their own diesel generator, they're not coming.
Yeah.
If they can't find skilled workers, they're not coming. If there isn't decent water and sanitation, half of manufacturing can't function. And the fourth kind of capital is the environmental capital. This continent is uniquely blessed with natural capital, and it's uniquely threatened now. It's under a lot of stress. And so there's going to have to be a lot of investment to protect the nature, to stop the deforestation, to protect the ecosystems, to protect the wildlife, which is key for tourism aside from everything else. And that requires a lot of investment as well. So the core that I'm emphasizing is we need a smart investment strategy more than anything else. And that investment has to be comprehensive. And I feel very much for the minister, and I want to turn to this now, when she says, I have to pick and choose. My budget does not allow this. Do you know that most African budgets right now do not have enough revenues to keep all children in school, period? It's not a matter of desire or not. It's a hard bottom line. Africa has a large young population. Sometimes 35 or 40% of the entire population is school age. And schooling costs something. There have to be teachers. The teachers have to be paid. There needs to be physical infrastructure. And if you're a finance minister and a minister of education comes to you and says, this is the real bill for universal upper secondary completion and for having enough higher education, a finance minister is going to say, that's wonderful. I agree completely, but I can't pay for this. That's 20% of GDP. You're asking me, that's my whole budget, my entire revenues. So these are the challenges that need to be addressed. I, by the way, fault the international system terribly that when Minister de Souza goes to the IMF, they don't care whether the children are in school or not. I guarantee you. There's no page in an Article 4 consultation checking on that fact. They don't care whether the health system has universal health coverage. It's terrible. And you know why? Because they don't care, honestly, just if you had any doubts. So you have to care because no one else cares. This is really important. You've got to get the kids in school. You've got to get the health coverage. You've got to get the electrification. And you can't be told, sorry, you have to wait. Your budget doesn't allow it, so you'll have to go another 10 years without electricity in half your country. Do you know what that means? That means 10 years from now, the situation will be more desperate. The population will have increased 30 or 40%. Children will not have gone to school. The physical environment will be worse, and there will be no business development, and you'll be blamed. You see, no governance. So it's a bunch of nonsense, actually. And what we need to show is what is the scenario to get out of this. Now, I don't have all of the answers by any means. That's why I'm so interested in this study. But I do believe in one thing that is really key and completely different from what my former students at the IMF and the World Bank believe. And that is that African governments should take on a lot more debt and use it to keep the kids in school, to build the electricity, to build the rail, to build the transport systems, because it can't wait. And if you do it right, the growth will be rapid so that what looks like a lot of debt today, 25 years from now, won't be very much debt at all. But the problem with my analysis, obviously, is I believe that Africa needs financing on 30-year borrowing, not on 5-year Euro bonds, which is nonsense, because development is a 30-year process. It is not a 5-year process. And if you borrow for 5 years, you'll get into debt trouble because you'll still be illiquid 5 years on. You'll be starting your investments. The kids in first grade will be in sixth grade. So what? Your debt will come due. And then they'll tell you you're in a debt crisis. Now you need austerity. And nobody thinks very hard about how to break this. But the way to break this is long-term finance. And that's one reason why I believe that the African Development Bank is completely central to this story, because the AFDB should be borrowing on behalf of Africa at a much, much, much larger rate, and then lending at maybe 10 times the amount that it lends now. And for 30-year low interest loans that enable Angola to have every child in school completely. So 20 years from now, completely different situation in the country. And everybody has electricity. And everybody has the basics that they need. And then, by the way, you have an incredibly creative population all over the continent. Boy, they're so creative, they make do with nothing. Imagine when they have all of the backing with them, then the possibilities are endless in so many areas. So to my mind, finance is central. So how to do this? Let me just give you a couple of tips. The World Bank will never give you the right answer, unfortunately. It's too close to the White House. It's at 18th in Pennsylvania. The White House is at 16th in Pennsylvania. The executive office of the president is at 17th in Pennsylvania. The IMF is at 19th in Pennsylvania. It's very tough. But you've got friends all over the place, and you need to use the friends all over the place. China is crucial for Africa's future development, no question. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries are crucial for Africa's development, no question. A lot of money there, a lot of capital to tap into. India will be crucial for Africa's development. There will be a lot of money to tap into. Don't just look to the US and Europe. look for novel solutions for this financing, and have a foreign policy that is friendly with everybody and closed off to nobody, and has nothing to do with who's number one in the world and number two, which is the only issue that matters to the United States. Otherwise, they don't care about anything. They just want to know they're number one. I don't know what even that means. But you have lots of sources of capital. And by the way, the cost of a 30-year loan, AAA, is 3%. Imagine if Africa could finance its development at 3%, 30-year borrowing. Believe me, the issues would be finished because you'd be on your way. This would be the biggest construction site in the whole world in history. Roads, power, housing, new factories. Now, the problem is Africa borrows at 13% on 5 years right now. This Eurobond stuff is useless, worse than useless. I wouldn't take any borrowing at less than 20-year maturity, anything. Because you can't run development on a year-by-year basis. And that's why what Professor Aroma was just showing, all these swings are basically finance swings. Commodities prices are high, finance is easy, you borrow. Commodities prices come down, finance is tough, then austerity. All that Africa's suffering is finance swings. And so what this study will show is the underlying strategy, which to my mind is a high investment rate in skills, in health, in physical infrastructure, and in business development. And it will show that that will produce growth of 7 to 10% per year. And I always teach my students the rule of 70, which is divide 70 by the growth rate, and that tells you the doubling time. So if you are growing 10% per year, 70 divided by 10 is 7. The economy doubles every 7 years. That's what China did. In 35 years, it doubled 5 times. If you double 5 times, it's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. 32-time increase in GDP in 35 years. That's what Africa can do. And then what looks like unpayable debt is nothing because you divide by 35. What difference if it's 200% of GDP today? Because the GDP is going to be 30 times larger in 30 years. But this way you'll have electricity, children in school, and the things that you need. So to my mind, that's what we're really, really about. And I'm convinced it's possible. I think the timing is right. I think the geopolitics are good. If it were still just a US-dominated world, I'd be more pessimistic. But the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil as a regional power means you have lots of friends all over the place, lots of partnerships in business all over the place, lots of pools of capital. And I'd go to the Gulf and I'd say, we want you to put it into the African Development Bank and we'll leverage it 3 or 4 times and we will absolutely deliver the core infrastructure for the continent. So to my mind, this geopolitical situation combined with the increase in capacity and vision and determination of the African Union itself makes a circumstance that gives reality to a rapid growth scenario. And this project will be the first ever quantified rapid growth scenario to say this isn't just dreams. Here it is, statistical work absolutely based on known properties, on standard analytics, but showing a different path from the one that has been imposed by lack of imagination and lack of caring, and one that is now possible through this kind of high-level politics that's coming properly into shape. So I'm extremely excited by this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. You have indeed been very, very helpful, and we are most grateful. Our colleague from the private sector is not able to be with us. Like I indicated earlier, there's a private sector segment on the African Continental Free Trade Area, but I'll proceed straight away to invite Dr. Hanan Mosin, the Deputy Executive Secretary of UNECA, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and Chief Economist. Basically, for you, it's a question of how to design Africa's growth pathway so that we fully harness the potential of the continent. And in terms of the presentation, do you think that it's possible to come up with a new growth scenario as a result of the efforts we are making? And from the United Nations point of view, do you have any recommendations that you could make to be incorporated in the study on inclusive growth and sustainable development? You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's such a fascinating discussion. Really hard to even think where to start on the things that I wanted to highlight. But let me perhaps start with kind of the areas that I really think they are fundamental and very much aligned with what is mentioned in the study. One, for growth, you do need the macroeconomic stability because investments will not happen without some policy certainty of what is, governing that system. It will need to really be based on moving up the value chain. We cannot get these levels of growth if we continue to rely on exporting commodities, and then, importing the higher processed, higher value added products. We will need to really build on these natural resources to build higher value added and then export them. So that will be essential. We will need to really, as has been said by Professor Sachs, we need to invest in the future. And investing in the future means that we need to invest in infrastructure and human capital. That will be key. We need to make sure that what we are investing in we need to make sure that what we are investing in is actually yielding higher rates of returns. Because for this to be sustainable, it needs to be bringing rates of returns to these investments that are higher than the cost at which we're borrowing. And we'll come to that cost of borrowing in a little bit. And then we definitely need, going forward, it needs to be private sector led because there is a limit to what the state can do. The levels of growth that we need to be really kind of, empowered by the private sector, led by the private sector. And the role of the government will be to provide the enabling environment to do that, providing the infrastructure, providing, the good business environment, the, stable regulatory environment. That will be really essential. And of course, on the issues, one of the key issues that many of the African countries will need to focus on is economic diversification. Really key, going beyond the, what has historically been the case of too much, focus on primary commodities, and the need to diversify and really reduce this very high level of exposure and vulnerability to global price shocks. And here, when we're talking about economic diversification, it's no longer, just the old model. Now we need to think of services as a key component of economic diversification in this day and age. Really investing in, the services sectors and sectors of the future, where actually, a part of the paradigm will be kind of almost rethinking also the industrialization, the future of industrialization. What worked in China and Korea is not going to be what works for the African countries now. China was built on the idea of the low-cost labor. With the advances in technology, this is not going to be the edge for Africa. Okay, this can be done by robots and other technological advances. We need to find our niche. It's going to be a different model. We can learn from the previous experiences in terms of what helped. So, for example, some of the things that was very useful in the Asian example was the case that the incentives to the industries were rule-based. So companies were getting incentives based on their abilities to raise their share of exports, the level of their high, value added. It was not so much left to discretion. And that is a very important element when we design these policies, how we really, in the governance of it, increase the component of being rule-based and reduce the discretion. But we will really need to, moving forward, to think of industrialization in terms of building around the comparative advantage of our countries. For example, Africa has 70% of the world green mining. There is huge potential. I mean, for example, in ECA, we've done a study in DRC about the potential of producing precursor batteries there. And the study shows that it can be produced there at 30% lower cost than China and US, and with lower net zero emissions. These are the type of things that we need to look at. How can we build around the existing endowment of these countries to really build much higher value added, and build around it also the regional value chains. This is how we move from the levels of growth that we have to much higher ones. So we'll need to really, in thinking of smart industrialization, we need to think of how do we develop around our endowment, and then how do we think of the future, where the world is moving, how do we leverage technology to leapfrog our development. Another very important area that has been mentioned is the issue of cost of capital. So, of course, we all agree that for the level of growth that we're talking about we need much higher level of financing. But first, let's take a stock of reality. At the current time, with the hike in interest rates by major developed central banks, we are turning into a new norm in access to international markets. So the levels of very low interest rates that the world, including African countries, have enjoyed following the financial crisis and quantitative easing, we're not going to see that anytime soon. What does this mean? It means that going forward, it's going to be much harder for African countries to get finance, but also much more expensive. And if you add that to the fact that even in good times, Africa had to pay a premium, an Africa premium of 100 to 270 basis points to borrow in international markets compared to other countries with the same type or similar fundamentals. So that, with the current realities of much higher, will make it, unaffordable for African countries to have, access, many African countries to have access to international markets. And this will be a constraint. And that's why it's very important, and that's what we're working on now with ministers of finance, to really look into the issues of reforming the global financial architecture. And, there's a high-level working group that is composed of the African Ministers of Finance, which ECA serves as the secretariat. It includes also the African Union, African Development Bank, IMF, World Bank, Afrexim Bank, and it has been discussing what is needed to actually reform the system. Because basically for this development and this needs to be tenable, that cost needs to be reduced, and that can be done through things like looking at issues of de-risking, basically having some sort of guarantees, perhaps for things like green finance to lower the cost of access to market. So we need to think of new paradigms to actually make these needs available, to actually avail more resources. And there are a number of areas that are needed there, because also the reality is when the cost of borrowing is very high for countries, it's even higher for the private sector. So what does this mean? It's really impeding not only for the government to finance its budget, but it's also impeding the private sector to play a larger role. So here becomes the issue of the need to really have more blended finance, so the private sector can actually have access to cheaper finance, the need to have more guarantees, the need to have credit enhancement tools, and to really improve the system, the global debt system, making it, making, for example, the G20 common framework more efficient, to function, smoothly, to actually allow a standstill of debt service at application for countries, to allow to actually also other countries like, middle-income countries to access that, to look into these issues in an orderly manner. It needs to really we need to move from the common framework being uncommon to actually being a common framework.
Let me request you to go towards summarizing. I'm
Sure.
reminded we have to go for a press conference soon.
Sure.
Okay.
So basically, we need to also improve for the debt market. We need to ensure that there are clauses that allows actually smoother restructuring, force majeure clauses. And we also need basically for the existing tools, currently for the international system, the existing tools to help countries were designed for country-specific shock. We've moved beyond this. What we've seen over the last few years are tsunami of global shocks. So the toolkits of international financial institutions need to adapt to that, to be able to provide funding when it's beyond the policy decisions or idiosyncratic shocks that are facing countries. And that's why it's important, for example, at the IMF to increase emergency financing, to extend emergency financing facilities for things like the war in Ukraine, to increase the access limits for countries so that they are able to actually borrow when they are faced with shocks, and to remove the type of surcharges that many middle-income countries actually 4 countries in Africa, middle-income countries in Africa, are faced with that when they have high financing needs because of the global shocks. So we need to look at all these issues to really reform the system and the ability to access. Another very important issue would also be for market access, would be the ability to actually reform the governance for the credit rating agencies. Currently, if Angola is rated, for example, by a credit agency and they don't agree with that rating, the only way that they can do is go through the internal system of that international rating company. There is no oversight body, international oversight body, independent one that regulates that. This is something that has to be looked at. It has been looked at after the European crisis for Europe, and they instituted a system by which this can be done. We need something similar, and then we need to make sure that the channeling of SDR is functioning and utilized in development through MDBs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm pressed for time. The future belongs to the youth. And because the future belongs to the youth, you have more opportunity to talk when we are long gone. So I'm going to request you to briefly, from a youth perspective, get us what key recommendations should be there in the study on key drivers for inclusive growth and sustainable development in Africa. I'll be most grateful if you can do it in about 5 minutes, because I'm told that we need to rush to the press conference and also give opportunities for discussion. So, our youth envoy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for the opportunity. It's very important that we have young people in the room. Being cognizant of time, I'm sure that we can continue this conversation offline and during lunch. So because of that, I'll just quickly focus on one aspect, and that aspect is on technology and innovation. Technology and innovation has the potential to transform the African continent, and the young people at the forefront of these developments. Governments and other stakeholders should prioritize investments in technology and innovation and ensure that young people have access to the necessary infrastructure and resources to participate in these sectors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very, very brief and very pointed. We are mostly grateful. It gives us room for some discussions from the audience, both in the room and from the virtual space. And like in the previous, like in the previous session, we'll give you 90 seconds. We start with the Professor Augustine Fosu, followed by Professor Adesoji Adelaja, thereafter Professor Ashraf El-Alabi, then Professor Melvin Ayoni, and we end up with my good sister Asom Diata. So 90 seconds. Thank you.
They are online.
You are online. Quickly. Professor Fosu, if you want to contribute. He's not here.
Then go to the others.
Okay, we move on. It doesn't seem to be there. The next one is Professor Adelaja. Quickly come on. He's also not there.
Next.
And then the Professor El-Arabi. The study consortium is not there. Professor Ayogu.
Not there.
Oh, they had to go for lunch.
Yes, they don't have access to speak. Please, the IT people, can you upgrade any of these colleagues that are being called?
They are not online, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, okay, thank you.
That's awesome.
They're not online. Go ahead.
Oh, understand they are not online.
Yeah.
So from the floor here, any contributions? Yes, I saw the hand there. Introduce yourself and make your contribution. 90 minutes. Yes, there. Right.
Thank you very much. Joa Tomensa with.
Okay.
Do I have the floor?
Yes, go ahead.
Joa Tomensa with the ECA. I'll just be quick. All that has been said on the floor is great if it can be done, but the practicality of it is that most African finance ministers don't have the money. And it's difficult for them to find money because the access to credit is choked. For the panelists, what practical thing can they do right now, given they don't have the money and they don't have access to, reforming the financial architecture, good. What Professor Jeffrey Sachs says, all that long-term, give ADB more money and then they'll double, all good on paper. But practically, now is the action that we need. The central banks themselves are fighting inflation by raising interest rates. In my country, in Ghana, the central bank rate is around 30%. Credit in the banks itself, commercial banks, is around 40%. I don't know why they're doing that. They're using the old model of fighting inflation, right? But you're choking off SMEs from borrowing access to credit. So my question for you, given that we have this inflation rising, is this the model that central banks should be using to fight inflation by raising interest rates? I don't know the answer to that. But
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Basically, I think that's a question for the finance minister of Angola, who is in this audience. Yes, and Professor Rama will also come on board to comment. The next contributor here, then we have one more, and we go to the group for the group photo and the press conference. Yes, down there. Yes, for the floor.
Sorry, let me try to be quick, but quite an interesting development that we are engaging into. My concern when the whole thing was being presented is the overemphasis on growth, which is important, but you have downplayed the redistribution aspect of it. You mentioned it only later. I'm afraid that it will also follow suit to appear only later. The reason I'm saying this is because Africa needs way more economic growth to reduce poverty than other regions of the world, which we know. And when we look at growth, we have to look at growth at all times together with the social underpinnings that make people to be excluded from the system. So I expected to see inequality and poverty at the center of it, so that when you are assessing the whatever interventions, it must not be on the basis of growth only, but also inclusivity to be the center of it. The second thing which I want to mention quickly is that the drive of Professor Jeffrey Sachs, whom I respect very much, on African governments to be indebted as a way of financing development. I say that we have to scrutinize it very much, because if good governance doesn't go hand in hand with that kind of borrowing, Africa might need to go backward. And that I really put a caution on it. And I say that we should look at how do we close the leakages of Africa's resources in order to bring it at the center of development financing, as opposed to growth. And we are also at the time that if we're not careful, Africa might be on a collision course with international geopolitics. The world is becoming increasingly polarized, and we have to be careful about that. That is all that I want to caution, but all is good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much on the issue of inclusive growth and the danger of external high levels of external indebtedness. I think the last one will be Asome, I understand she's in 90 minutes. Can you make a contribution? Then we'll allow our colleagues to provide answers to the questions. Are you there? So Mediata doesn't seem to be there. In the meantime, can we have the answers to the questions? Professor Rama, then the Honorable Minister of Finance of Angola. Then we go towards closing.
Okay, thank you, Your Excellency. Both are really very pertinent questions. The whole issue of financing and the lack of fiscal space for African finance ministers. But that's the challenge that we have in this study, to come up with innovative financing options that will actually ease that fiscal space. So that's one of the things that really needs to be worked on in terms of moving forward on this. Now, fighting inflation and choking SMEs, when we were presenting in the morning, we did raise the issue of the need for coordinated fiscal and monetary policy making. Because you are very right that if we just use the old model, which many economists are beginning to realize that maybe we didn't really understand how to manage inflation effectively without actually killing the growth process. Because inflation, growth, SMEs, all these things come together, and we need to be able to think carefully on how to really use raising interest rates to tame inflation, where it's acute, but also a moderated approach where the inflation is not really that acute. So we need to think about that. And if you read the report, the macroeconomic performance and outlook report, there was a huge chunk of that devoted to looking at that policy coordination aspect. The emphasis on growth, of course, when you are presenting in a 20-minute study that is supposed to go for 40 to address issues that has been there for long, you miss emphasis on some things. But remember that the topic is inclusive and green growth. Inclusive growth and sustainable development. So the issue of inclusion is central to what we are thinking through, and how to make growth more inclusive and avoid the enclaved economies that Professor Banjo Yinka talked about. Now, the issue of governance is key, whether we borrow or we don't borrow. So you can't actually achieve any high rate of growth at a sustained level if we don't deal with the three issues that we talked about from Singapore: meritocracy, and pragmatism, and the honesty aspects of things. So without transparency and accountability in the system, all these things we're talking about can just be creating opportunities for more leakages. And we can't agree with you more about dealing with leakages. 90 billion is 3.7% of Africa's GDP. And like I joked when I was presenting, if we only plug that, add that 3.7% to what we have now, and we're already achieving our goals. So a key focus on public financial management is central. And that is why the African Development Bank, World Bank, and IMF, and several institutions in Africa have launched the Public Financial Management Academy. We have a lot of the faculty members here working with countries to provide technical assistance to try and help countries to address some of those issues that lead to those leakages in the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, briefly, then we close the session.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for the questions. About the lack of fiscal space and how to address the social needs and the infrastructure needs, considering our capacity of mobilizing fiscal revenues. I think we can act on both sides. On the revenue sides, we can keep working on formalizing business and services, because we are not capturing the potential coming from there, because we have a lot happening outside the formality, and not only small business, even bigger, but they are completely out of the radar. So we need to put them inside to make sure that we broaden the tax base and we capture more fiscal revenues. Also on real estate, we have a lot of potential, a lot of entities that have real estate are not paying the tax that they should pay. I think we can do a little bit more effort on the fees, on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, I agree partially with the professor and also with the intervention that our colleague raised about the importance of both going together. The good debt in terms of period, in terms of small interest rates, but also the quality of expenditures. And also being wise, making choices. Because Angola, I will talk about Angola because I know better this reality. Angola is huge. We have needs of almost everything. And everything in numbers, in figures of billions, $20 billion to electricity, to cover all the country, $20 billion to cover all the country with potable water, and so on. So even if the money appears 30 years, 1-2%, it would not be possible for us to do everything at the same time because we had to serve that debt. Even on 30 years, even on 2% of interest rate. So we need to see where to start to make sure that putting electricity there, putting water there, creating the infrastructures there, both public and private sector will make the economy vibrant. And with that, we will see the GDP start growing, more revenues coming, and expand those strategy of putting in place more infrastructures. And also being transparent, trying to look the best equation, quality, price, to make sure that we are not increasing the debt, but we are not paying the best product or paying too much for the best product. So it's something that needs to go together. About the interest rates and the central bank strategy, well, I'm not from the central bank. As you know, as finance minister, we used to be in the other side of the frontier as compared to the central bank. But we are following closely the strategy of the Central Bank of Angola. They are not increasing the interest rates. They are working more on the open market operations and the compulsory reserves and avoiding to increase the cost of borrowing of the local entities. I think it's working. We are seeing the inflation coming down. We were in 2016 at 40%, and now in December we are around 14. At the medium terms, we want to reach the one-digit targets. So the strategy that the central bank is following, I think, is making. We are seeing results, and at the same time are harming not so much the economy. That was my comments, and to try to address those questions that was raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for participating, for contributions, all the institutions, or the countries that are here, and you have moved us a step further. The idea is that we finalize the study by 31st December, so that it goes to the summit in February 2020.
Hello. Hello, bonjour. Commissioner. Sorry.
Okay, okay. Can I give you 90 minutes?
Yes.
90 seconds.
I'm sorry. I slept for 3 hours. 90 seconds. 90 seconds.
The commissioner is my brother, so I can abuse. Merci beaucoup, commissaire, professeur Ourama, Excellence, Monsieur le ministre, Madame le ministre. Je me réjouis de participer à cette session pour dire que cette étude que nous sommes en train de mener est une étude extrêmement importante pour l'avenir du continent africain. Et je voudrais remercier le président de la Zambie, qui est le champion, mais aussi solliciter son appui aux experts pour l'obtention des données, mais l'engagement des gouvernements. Nous savons tous qu'en Afrique, parfois, pour avoir accès aux documents, aux données, c'est très difficile. Mais vu l'engagement du président de la Zambie, nous restons persuadés qu'avec son appui, nous pourrons y arriver. Moi, je suis personnellement très intéressée par cette étude, déjà parce que je suis africaine, femme, mais aussi parce que j'ai eu à participer aux négociations sur la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine. Et je voudrais que ces résultats-là puissent réellement se concrétiser par une forte croissance. Les aspects liés aux investissements sont extrêmement importants. Nous devons compter sur nous-mêmes d'abord. Et nous voyons que de plus en plus, en Afrique, les investissements intra-africains sont en train de progresser de façon significative. Mais aussi, nous savons que nous utilisons peu les retombées, en tout cas, nous bénéficions peu des retombées du commerce des services. C'est pourquoi une attention particulière sera accordée à cette question, non seulement pour améliorer notre agriculture, transformer et nous industrialiser, mais aussi vraiment améliorer de façon générale notre économie. Et la question également liée aux petites et moyennes entreprises, au secteur privé de façon générale, c'est une question extrêmement importante qui mérite toute l'attention requise. Donc, je voudrais m'en arrêter là, compte tenu du temps qui est très serré, et saluer toute l'équipe du professeur Ourama, qui a fait un très bon boulot. Nous attendons maintenant le partage du document final pour commencer le travail. Je vous remercie. Merci beaucoup, commissionnaire.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. I was saying we are moving towards the closing and thanking all the contributors and indicating that our timeline is to ensure that we deliver the product by 31st December this year. In between, there are going to be a lot of stakeholder consultations involving regional economic communities, development cooperation partners, the member states and the other stakeholders, including the civil society. Certainly, you will see more of us as we come along. I think China came up quite a lot. I'll just give you one more example. In 2019, just before the COVID-19 pandemic, in Mandela Hall, which is the room across, a team from China came to share with us their experiences in overcoming absolute poverty in China before the end of the 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And they attributed this, among others, inclusive growth. So when we focus on inclusive growth, we should be able to ensure that we leave no one behind in the development process. So once again, thank you each and every one of you. It is an ongoing process. We're going to continue. As everybody refuses to cut. Yes. All of you have invitation cards for the lunch. So let's proceed to the lunch, but in between, some of us may go to the press conference. Okay, yes. Okay, so the press conference has been removed to 3 o'clock, but it gives us the time to go for lunch. So enjoy your lunch. You have ended it by coming here. The meeting is ended. Thank you. Let's go to Mandela Hall for the group photo for the start. It's on the way to the lunch. Okay.
Anything that I have not heard before. That's what I'm saying. One of the challenge is that if it is to write